Hey everybody, my name is Milecia, and today I'll be talking to you about using Storybook to maintain your components in Redwood. So a little background on me before we get started. I'm a developer advocate at iterative.ai, where I work on the DVC team, and that's an open source tool that's really useful when you're working with data version control for machine learning projects, which is probably one of the furthest things away from what I'll be talking about today. But I also have about 7-8 years of experience in front-end development, back-end, DevOps, other engineerings. Pretty much if it's in the tech world, I've probably dabbled in it at least a little bit, but JavaScript is just a part of who I am at this point. And you can follow me on Twitter at Flipped Coding, and I post stuff on there about different tech stuff that I'm doing, and I don't know what other random stuff comes up in regular life. But today I want to talk to you about Storybook in Redwood. So before we just jump into it, I want to give you some background on component-driven development. So what this is basically it helps you model your systems better because you're able to build independent components. So maybe you've used something like Bootstrap, or I think Tailwind might do something like that, I'm not sure. But if you've used any type of UI library, you've worked with component-driven development. So the components get developed independently of the APIs or the overall architecture of an app. You just have things like little buttons and widgets and maybe some graphs that you work on separately from everything. And the purpose of doing component-driven development is so that when you are developing components, they're built in such small pieces that when you go to work with your data and you're pulling things from APIs or you're making requests to APIs, you're able to focus on that data more. You don't have to worry about, which props am I passing to this component, or do I need to make a new thing to handle this type of data? You already have a library of components available to you. So you're able to focus on just things like performance and making sure that the data has the right shape and you're sending the right requests to your backend. So that's a quick background on component-driven development. So now let's talk a little bit about Storybook and what it is. So Storybook is a tool that lets you develop components in complete isolation from your app. That means you don't even have to run your app to develop your components. So this is at least my favorite feature with Storybook because, sometimes you're working on things like toggles and drop-down menus and things like that. But then you have to worry about making these requests, you have data you need to fetch and all this other stuff. And all you really want to do is style that specific component. So Storybook takes away all of that extraness and lets you actually develop a component, which is really nice. But something else that is really cool with is when you're working with the team, or even if it's just you, it helps you document all of your components. So a lot of times we work on these components, they go through a few iterations. You have a bunch of different props, they have different names, maybe they trigger different function calls, and then the person that wrote everything leaves. That means somebody else has to go through and figure out how things work, which of course is possible, but it's a lot easier when you already have that documentation for the component just available to you. So with Storybook, not only do you develop components in isolation, you also have the ability to add documentation to that. So there's no ambiguities later on. And something else, once you have all of this set up, it really makes writing tests a lot easier, because in a way, you've set your components up to be perfectly testable because they work in isolation from everything else. That means you know if there's an issue with the data coming in versus a bad prop value in your component later. So when you develop with components in mind and you use a tool like Storybook, it just makes it a lot easier for you to do, well, long-term maintenance of your apps. And now we're going to talk about Redwood, switch gears a little bit and talk about this cool framework I've been working with. And it's a full stack JavaScript framework, but the thing about this is it handles a lot out of the box for you. So the front end is built with React, and you have a GraphQL backend server, and you use Prisma to work with your database. So if you're using something like Postgres or MySQL, and they've recently made some kind of update where you can work with MongoDB with Prisma, so you have plenty of database options. GraphQL is just a great backend, so there's that. And of course, React it won the battle basically. But Redwood has all of this set up for you just straight out of the box. But it also comes with Storybook integration, which we're going to take a look at pretty soon. And it comes with authentication integration. It comes with testing built in. It comes with a bunch of other stuff that I'm blanking out on right now, but you can always go take a look at their docs. But this is the perfect framework when you know that you have an app that's gonna have to scale. Usually people build with like Next.js or something, but when you start adding stuff to it, it gets kind of tricky. Like, you can of course add authentication to Next.js, but Redwood comes with that already baked in. So when you need it, you just throw in a few components and you're done. It's already there. So it has a bunch of tools for you as soon as you set up the app that are just worth taking advantage of, basically. So with that being said, we're gonna actually switch to a small live demo that I really hope goes well, because I practiced it 2 minutes before I started recording this. So we're gonna work with a new project in Redwood. So let me switch over to VS Code, and you'll see I already have this app set up. So if you want to make a new Redwood app, you just run yarn create Redwood app and then the name of it. So that'll look something like this. So you'd have yarn create Redwood app, and for this I called it Storybook demo. So if you run this, it will generate all of the files and directories that you see over here. And I'm going to clear that out and give you just a quick tour. But the main things you need to know: the API folder holds all of our backend stuff. So this is where we use Prisma to connect to our database and set up the schema. In the source folder, in the API folder, we have all of the GraphQL stuff. So in this GraphQL folder, this is where we will put all of our types for our GraphQL server. And then in this services folder, this is where you'll find all of your GraphQL resolvers. So that's it for the back end. And then here on the front end, you'll definitely want to dig into the Redwood docs some more, but the gist of it is this is where you put components that you use throughout the different pages. Layouts is where you put, just layouts for groups of pages. So maybe you have some kind of dashboard or something like that, and you want everything to have a certain like CSS thing, where it looks a certain way basically. And then here in pages, this is where you'll actually put together the stuff that appears on the routes when users are navigating through your app. So what I'm gonna do is just show you that Redwood has Storybook running right out of the box. So I'm gonna run yarn Redwood Storybook, and you'll see that this is starting up our Storybook. And in a few more seconds, I'm gonna show you what it looks like in the browser. So let me switch over to that. And ta-da! This is what Storybook looks like straight out of the box with Redwood. And I'll go through a couple of things before we actually add a custom component. But pretty much here what you're seeing is this homepage view that we have. This was automatically generated by Redwood, but it comes with its own story built in. So here in the canvas is where you'll be able to see the story that you write for whatever component you're making. Here's where you'll be able to navigate through different components based on types. So right here you can see we have pages for our high level organization of components. So if you had this home page and maybe you have a user view where a table loads where you show the user some kind of data, maybe you want to look at that here in isolation without calling any APIs or something. So just a really quick rundown of what Storybook looks like. There's a bunch of other stuff you can look at here. Like Storybook has some cool add-ons that make it easy to do things. So yeah, this is just a quick glance at Storybook before we actually add a component. So now I'm going to go back to VS Code and we'll add a component here. So I'm going to split my terminal. Well, that's not split. Split the terminal here. And what I'm going to do is generate some Redwood components. So I'm going to run yarn rw, which is shorthand for Redwood, g, which is shorthand for generate, and I'm going to do component, and I'm going to name it button. Oh, let me change my Node version. I always forget that. So make sure you're running Node somewhere between 14 and 15 if you're using Redwood. So I'm going to go back up and generate this button component. This is just one of the Redwood CLI commands that makes it super easy to make new things. But as you can see here, just running that command, we have this new directory under components, and it already has our JS file. It already has the Storybook file. I want you to notice that. And it even has a test file for us already. So just showing you how powerful Redwood is with all of the stuff it just bakes in for you. We have a story and a test and the component with just this one CLI command. I always think that's really cool. But if we go back over to our Storybook here, you'll notice that we have a new component section. Ooh. And it has our button in it. And now you see what's actually in that button file. So this is what the component looks like. And you see how it's already grouped. So this comes in handy when you're working with a lot of different components of a lot of different types. That way you don't have to scroll forever to find what you're working with. But now that we have this button set up, let's actually go ahead and update our component to something that you might actually use at work. So I'm gonna just clear this split terminal over here, and we're going to make a new button. One thing I do need to do is add the styled components library into the web directory. So I'm gonna run yarn add styled components. Okay. That node version difference gets me every time. And maybe I have style component installed already, but just want to make sure. So what I'm going to do is go over here into the button component itself, and I'm going to import styled from styled components. And I'm going to make a couple of 3 different buttons. So I'm going to export a primary button here where I have just let me see something. Actually, let me start with the styled component. So I'm going to make a button, and it's going to be styled.button. And I'm going to add a few styles. So first, I'm going to set a different background color based on a prop that gets passed in. So we'll have our props, and you're going to have to forgive this terrible ternary that I'm about to make, but it has to be done. So I'm going to start out with this dark type here, and question marks on. I was going to try to type this out, but I'm actually just going to copy and paste this in here since I already have it written. But basically what I've done here is taken a prop that we will pass from our button based on whatever button we have. If it's dark, we'll give it a background color of this. If it's a secondary button, it'll have this color. And if it's a primary button, it will have this color. Then we'll move on to the text color, which I'll also just go ahead and copy and paste that in here, because all we're doing is changing the color based on the prop type. And lastly, I'll just give it some padding so it looks okay for what we're doing. Then I'll go ahead and export these buttons here. So you see we have a primary button, a secondary, and a dark one. And these are all based on this type. So if I save this and then come over here and update my Storybook import, so I'll have primary, secondary, and dark. And then I'll return all 3 buttons for now. So let me get a fragment here and do that. Clean it up a little bit. Add the secondary button and then this dark one. And now if I save it, maybe that made everything better. Or maybe I just need to restart this. So let's see if Storybook will continue to fuss at me or if I'm actually going to get this right the first time. This is always the fun part of live demos. It's like, why is this not working now? Styled from styled components. But that installed over here. And I'm in the web directory. So, let me think for a quick second. So it's saying that my styled components isn't resolving, but in the package JSON, I do have styled components installed. Huh. That is weird. Let me see if I can maybe do some quick debugging. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy and paste in my original code that I wrote before the demo started. So let me see if this is any different. I don't see why it would be because it's the same import statement, but I have had weirder things happen. Okay, so it's not that. And when I check my package, you know what? I'm just gonna nuke my node modules here and run a yarn. So let's see if that fixes my weird dependency issue. We'll see. I'm not sure, but we'll see. So if I refresh my web folder, okay, I see my node modules are in here. Not quite sure what that is in there though. Okay, well, I'm not quite sure what I did, which is the way it usually goes, but it works again, so I'm just gonna take the win. All right, let's switch over to the browser while everything is still working. And now you see these new buttons here, right? So what I'm gonna do now is, since everything's working and I'm pretty happy about that, I'm gonna go back over here and try not to break it. But the fun thing about Storybook is that in this case, we have this primary button. So let's say we wanted to add some documentation around this and just kind of describe what this button is. So this is the main type of button we use in our apps. So if I save this and then switch back over to the browser, now you see how you can start to label things and explain how stuff works with Storybook. So if I come back over to VS Code again, you'll see I'm gonna add another H2 for the secondary button. Now just copy this down here. This is the second type of button we use in our apps. And then I'm just gonna copy these two and change this to dark button. And this is the dark type of button we use in our apps. And this time I'll say it has a type prop of dark. So I'll save that and we'll switch over back to the browser and ta-da! Now you see how we can actually use component-driven development to make stuff that's useful. Hopefully you see how this makes things maintainable. Like anytime you want to come in and change that button, the story is already there in that component folder for you. So you can update both at the same time and it shouldn't be too big of a difference. So if you're adding more props or you're adding more types of buttons to that button file, you can easily throw that into this story and explain it to future you or future developers. So that is how Storybook works in Redwood. I'm gonna try to switch back over to my slides, which, yay, it worked. But now, let's say you're not using Redwood and you already have some kind of React app, or maybe you have an Angular app or Vue or whatever framework you're using, and you're like, hey, it'd be cool if I could have Storybook in this project I already have going. Good news. If you go into your existing project, make sure though you are using some kind of framework. So a good React, a good Vue, Angular, whatever the other popular ones are right now. You have to have an existing project. You can check out the Storybook docs for more info on why it has to be an existing one, but basically it's hard to add Storybook to an empty project because there aren't any components. I think that's basically the gist of it, but I'm sure there's some more technical detail behind that. But if you do want to add Storybook to an existing project, it's as simple as running this command that you see here, this npx sb init, and this basically bootstraps Storybook for you. So it'll install some default configs to get you up and running, and then you can start adding your story files to your project, and Storybook will start to pick those up. If you didn't notice in Redwood, all of the Storybook files had .stories.js, and that's how Storybook picks up which files it should look at for, stories. So now that you've seen what component-driven development is, you've learned a little bit about how Storybook works, you've seen how Redwood works, and you know the command to add Storybook to your existing projects, it's time for me to go ahead and wrap up with some takeaways. So the first thing that I hope you really get from this is just seeing how component-driven development can make long-term maintenance of a project easier. So instead of having to go in and update the entire app or, start it up and make a PR and then deploy to prod, and then some other weird issue happens that's not related to your component update, now you can just not worry about that and develop your components in complete isolation. You can add documentation as you go so there's no confusion around props, and all of this together just makes it easier for long-term maintenance because new developers can get up to speed quicker, and current developers can kind of transfer some of that domain knowledge that they have to these components. And something else, I'm kind of a Redwood nerd at the moment, and it just bootstraps a lot of stuff for you. So if you did make your database schema with Redwood, there's a few commands you can run, and it basically generates your front end and your back end, and you can just make CRUD requests with one CLI command. So check out Redwood because it's wild how much it just does for you. And then keep trying new things. This is just something that I personally believe in, is that there's a lot of new stuff out there, and there's a reason it exists. It doesn't mean you have to swap out your whole life to use it, but just check it out, try new stuff out, and see if maybe it solves a problem you have. And if it doesn't, at least you know about this new thing, and maybe you can take some of the ideas you get from it or some of the things you learn and do something else with it. So that is all that I have for you, and I hope that you had a good time watching me mildly panic trying to debug that really fast. So feel free to reach out to me on Twitter @FlippedCoding if you have any questions about this or Redwood or just general tech things.
Hey, it's Joe Eames with ng-conf. If you like that video, be sure to click subscribe either here or here, somewhere over here. And if you're looking for something more, here's another video for you to watch here or there or somewhere.